And as promised, we're going to be joined by the son of Donald Trump Jr. He's a political activist. He's the host of a podcast, Triggered with Don Jr. Donald Trump Jr., thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. I start with just the most obvious question. How's your dad? How's he doing?
Yeah, actually, he's doing pretty well. With the Trumps, whether it's perhaps just our genes or whether it's sort of the 6-7 years of the constant and never-ending barrage of attacks, perhaps get a little bit immune to some of the insanity that's going on. The EQ, the emotional quotient component of things, may be a little bit different than it would have been under normal circumstances. And so I actually, I heard that right as I was about to go live on my Triggered podcast last night, literally 5 minutes before my phone starts blowing up, and I was like, I went, did it, and then I drove down to Mar-a-Lago. I didn't even call my dad. I just drove down there. He's 25 minutes away. And I was, assuming he'd be in his room, whatever. He's out having dinner with some friends. And, I guess you've been immune to some of the nonsense, unfortunately.
It seems rather apparent to me your dad is going to run for president come hell or high water. I think the Democrats know that. And so what are they hoping to accomplish with this indictment over something as silly and as inconsequential as this? What do they think is going to be the upside?
I don't know, but I could say that about a lot of the policies that they're pushing, right? I see the defense of, the trans insanity, some of that's going on. I see the destruction of our energy sector in America. I see, the start of never-ending wars and, antagonizing the world's largest by volume of missiles, Russia in the Ukraine. So just because they're doing it doesn't mean I can make any sense of it. But I think what they're trying to do is they're trying to prevent him from being able to run because they fear that he's the only guy that can shut down the nonsense. I think now that he knows that, he came in as a political outsider, but now he's experienced all that. I think going back in now, actually, I think being a lame duck, even knowing you can only have 4 years, I think that's an advantage. And I think they're deathly afraid of him going down there and literally just breaking down all of the systems that they and, frankly, the Republican uni-party sort of agreed to. It's like, well, we'll pretend we're on really different sides, but as long as we got, our retirement plans with big war and all the other nonsense, we'll kind of wink, wink, nod, nod and get along. I think they're deathly afraid of that. I mean, I think this is election interference, like we haven't seen before, despite, I think, what we all saw in 2020. I think if they get their desire, it's perhaps, the end of the republic as we know it. But honestly, Jason, I think you articulated this so well last night on Tucker. Real people are seeing what's going on. Real people who aren't that political, who saw the difference between what's in their wallet under Trump, despite what you read on, in the news or saw in the background on TV daily. He was going to start World War III, and yet magically nothing happened. He was the only guy actually stopping that. He was the only guy getting us out of the wars. He was going to tank the economy, but it was the strongest it's ever been. Your 401k was a disaster. It was going to be a disaster under Trump. What's inflation done to that under Joe Biden? What has the bank collapse that we've seen and is only going to get worse over the last few weeks? People realize they've been lied to. So if they get away with the election interference that they're clearly attempting to do, what does that say about where we are as a country? But I do think people understand that sort of the vision, the notion of America that we all believed or want to believe, it's far more gone than many thought. Even people like myself who've sort of been, I've done 50 hours of testimony before congressional committees for treason, a crime punishable by death. And yet Hunter Biden can take billions from the Chinese, tens of millions from Russia, Ukraine, and no one will even ask the question is our weak on China policy because They have another one of the countless laptops that seems to be floating around. Are we making decisions in Russia and Ukraine to the tune of $130 billion that may be influenced because they too have other information on this guy? And the fact that we're not even asking that question is a little bit scary. I think real people are waking up to that, and they're fed up because they're realizing just how bad it actually is and how much worse it is than even the most cynical person could have imagined.
So back in 2018, 19, I wasn't compelled to vote back in 2014 and 15. In 2016, I was not compelled to vote for your dad. I've always tried to stay out of politics. Yeah. And then I heard your dad's inauguration speech. And that was the first thing that really hit me in the heart. It's because of the way I grew up. My mother was a factory worker. My dad didn't graduate high school. He started out a factory worker, and then he had a little neighborhood bar that catered to factory workers. And your dad's inauguration speech talked about bringing manufacturing jobs back. And I can remember telling my mom and other people, I was like, I think you need to listen to this dude's inauguration speech. I think he's talking about us and the way that I grew up and my brother grew up. Because my very working class parents were able to push their two sons to a college education and a better life. And that's when I really became a fan of Trump, but still not to the point of wanting to really get involved in politics. But I'm wondering how your dad, the Trumps, who a lot of wealth, even before your dad increased that wealth, how did he become the voice for the working man and the working class? I know why I'm still that way because of my roots and my background. It'll never, how much money I ever make, I'll always identify as working class. But how did your dad get there?
Yeah, no, listen, that's sort of one of the great ironies, right? That the brash billionaire from New York City with the glitzy glam lifestyle and all that became the voice of the forgotten man and woman of America. And honestly, I think it has to do with the way he was brought up. But you got to remember the business that he was in. He built buildings. That's what he did, right? People say, oh, he was on TV. No. Before all that, he built buildings. He dealt with construction workers. The way Trump was different than so many of the people in the real estate sector was that he was the guy that spent countless hours on a job site. When we were growing up, that's where my brother and I started, hanging sheetrock, driving bulldozers. He's like, if you're going to build a building one day, you better damn well know how to do it yourself, not just do that from a sort of a ritzy office. So he always understood. He got more great information. He became a better builder by spending time with the guys on site. He could go around and, if they're ducting something, well, why are you doing it this way? What do you think about this? Well, Mr. Trump, if you did it this way, you could actually save, some ceiling height and make the room bigger. And he'd be like, that's genius. The architects couldn't figure that out in an office on a piece of paper. And so, I think he was always more comfortable with that. I used to they'd made fun of me a couple of times because I said it in interviews, way before The Apprentice and before politics. I go, he's sort of a blue collar billionaire. If there's such a thing, he can play the glitz glam thing for the brand because that was sort of the means to the end in the business. But, he knows more about sports than the vast majority of people who are in the industry. He's watching, his happy place would be watching a baseball game and eating a pizza or McDonald's. So I think he always just resonated well with those guys. I think he always respected them probably much more than, the executives that he was dealing with. And he understood that. I think I got a little bit of the similar taste by growing up. Like I said, he put me on construction jobs. That's what I did during my summers. I had the added benefit of, having a mother that escaped communist Czechoslovakia and who sent me there for a couple of weeks every summer with my grandfather in the early 80s, right? A little different. So I've waited in those bread lines. I spoke the language fluently. I had friends there. I've seen what those systems do to people. And so, unbeknownst to me, probably at the time, it was a bit of the beginnings of my political leanings, because I'm not supposed to be a conservative. I'm the son of a billionaire from Manhattan who went to an Ivy League university and yada yada yada, and yet I'm out there fighting for this because, again, I grew up with those people, and that was probably always my happy place anyway. Regular people. I didn't do the New York City rubber chicken nonsense. Charity circuit. I didn't care if I wanted to be loved by those people. I worked during the week, and on the weekends I went up to my farm in Northeast PA and hung out with real Americans. So I guess we all got it a little bit differently, but I think that's how he formed that mentality. He understood those guys because he'd actually spent real time with them.
Well, it has certainly resonated with me, and I regret that it's taken me this long to get where I'm at right now, but I am Team MAGA. I'm not coming up off Team MAGA. The other option has been Ron Desantis, and I was wondering what you think, and perhaps if you wanted to share, you could answer it either way, what you think or what your dad think, or both, about Ron DeSantis' statement yesterday that he was not going to cooperate with Alvin Bragg and New York on this indictment.
Well, listen, again, obviously you're in a political race, but, I saw the original statement last week where, this isn't a real issue. I was like, really? You don't think the weaponization of our government against their political enemies, like this is stuff that, Jason, would make Stalin blush, So like last week, it wasn't that big a deal. Last week, it was a pretend issue. And then, just like Ukraine, I guess, whether he got permission from his donors or otherwise to change his mind yesterday, then he changed his mind. So that's what's troubling to me is, you think someone sort of, MAGA, and I wish we had a deeper bench of people who are willing to fight. But again, in Washington, D.C., it's an easy existence to be a Republican that folds to sort of the ruling party and to the media elite, because, you can get away with a lot. You can go, tell the people at home what they want to hear in a small room. And when you get to D.C., as long as you fold when it really matters, they'll leave you alone. You can have a different view and all this, but as long as you give up every time. And, again, I had sort of, bigger hopes for DeSantis, but I saw the same thing with Ukraine. He sort of took the Trump approach, like, hey, why are we starting another endless war with a nuclear power to protect, arguably a more corrupt regime than even Russia? And I'm not being a Russia apologist. I'm just stating basic facts. He sort of took a soft approach on that. And then his donors and the Karl Roves and, Paul Ryans, who are, de facto running the campaign, we're like, oh, you can't say that. And then, 5 minutes later, he flipped after being, he told Tucker one thing. And then 2 days later, it was a totally different thing. I'm like, oh, man, because I was hoping we had a deeper bench. I want more people to be willing to actually get out there and really fight. I mean, people had, over the last few months, once my father announced they stopped putting me in there, but they had me for some reason in these polls being like, 2 or 3 for 2024 as the presidential candidate. Like, why? I've never even put my hat in the ring. I'll fight because I believe in this stuff. But if I'm there, I'm not saying that maybe I'm good at it and I've created a following, but man, we need more. It can't just be that. But I think what you need right now is you need a Trump. You need someone who's been there, who's got the proven results, who doesn't care, who doesn't need the big dollar donor money. There's a big difference. And what people don't understand, the money game in politics, there's going to be a lot of people pushed to run by the consultant class in Washington, D.C., because they're going to take 20% of the funds raised. They're going to take another 20% on the ad buy every time someone runs a commercial. Their buddy's going to write the commercial. They're going to get a kickback for the work that they're giving to their friends. I mean, the whole thing in D.C. is a scam. It's a big, big money play. And so there's going to be Republicans pushed to run or convinced to run by a lot of sort of D.C. scumbags that have a lot of money to it. There are tens of millions for those people to be made, and they're not going to sit out a cycle because it's the right thing to do. And I think people have to be aware of that. So to me, it's a no-brainer. You need the guy that will break down the system. Just what they're trying to do shows you how much they're afraid of what Trump could do. I mean, think about that. I mean, this has never been done before. The charge has never been even prosecuted as a felony. The federal government and the Federal Election Commission, the people who'd been trying to put Trump in jail for the last 6 years, They opted not to pursue this with all the same facts. But then a Soros-funded DA comes in and says, well, I guess I'm going to pursue it. It's a no-brainer. No, he's doing what he's told, right? Like, this is unprecedented in America. This would be unprecedented practically in communist China. And that's where we're going. And it just shows you how much they fear Donald Trump and what he will do to the system if put back in the White House. And man, as an American, I feel like we need to bring this thing back down, strip it down to the bones, and start from scratch, because no one's been delivering for real Americans. The notion, all those notions are, that's out the window. We've seen that. They've lied to us constantly, but we have to stop believing those lies.
Don, Bryson Gray is here with me. He lives here in Tennessee, comes on the show quite often. Bryson, of course, made the song Let's Go Brandon. Hardcore Trump supporter, was at January the 6th. We've had a spirited discussion today about your dad, and in particular, well, one thing that struck a chord with me is Bryson being at January 6th feels like, and I don't want to speak, well, I will speak for Bryson. He feels like some of the January 6ers were hung out to dry by your dad, by Republicans. Jacob Hansley, QAnon shaman, just getting out of jail, I think yesterday, and now, who is it, Bake the Last one just got out. Just got out. What do you say to the people on January 6th that felt like your dad owed them pardons or just more support while they're sitting in jail because they are hardcore Trump supporters?
Well, listen, I think you got to look at context at the time, right? The QAnon shaman got out because the Democrats who controlled the video, right? Nancy Pelosi, Speaker of the House at the time, had the video, had this. They refused to release it. The second they did, all of a sudden, it's exculpatory. So you had between January 6th and January 20th, the transition of power. No one knew exactly what went on. You're told it was an insurrection, perhaps the first unarmed insurrection in the history of the world, but everyone out there doing that. It's sort of like the origins of COVID, right? A doctor is saying this, backed by the entire $1 trillion mainstream media and $1 trillion big tech enterprise, censoring, shutting down anything that's to the contrary. The reality is, at the time, you didn't know exactly what was going on. So, I get it, dude. And I think if you've looked at my social media, I've been really vocal about that stuff. And far before we even sort of got that video that was exculpatory. I mean, I do think there should be accountability, and people should go to jail for allowing people who are nonviolent offenders to sit in prison for 2 years. But that's because the Democrats controlled the video and refused to release it. That's because they allowed their lackeys in the mainstream media to run with a narrative that wasn't accurate. If you remember what was going on in those 2 weeks and what was said about what actually happened, there was no way to actually dispel that notion. And of course, you always made the distinction sort of between violent and nonviolent, but the reality, we didn't know. We were told everyone was violent. Then you start seeing a selfie video of a grandmother, and you start hearing the stories, but that was after we were out, and the Democrats were more than happy to do that. The Joe Biden, most transparent administration in the history of the world, they wouldn't release those videos because they knew exactly what it would do to the narrative. So we got to remember that we are not, Jason, we're not in a fair fight. In this game, we are up against multiple trillion-dollar institutions, big tech, social, mainstream media, frankly, woke corporate, who are telling you all of these things are the gospel. If you go out against them, they canceled Trump. They threw him off social media. They can cancel the most powerful man in the world. They'll intimidate you. They'll put a social consequence on you if you even take the conservative mindset. Look how silent big corporate has been this week after a lunatic, sociopath, trans person kills a group of Christian children murdered in cold blood. And the White House yesterday, we must protect the trans community because they're in fear. They're in fear. Like, what about the children? So you have to put those things in perspective. And again, I think I've been very loud on the issue. over the last 4 years, but it was very hard to do something in that like 10-day period of time where you didn't know they're going after you, they're impeaching you again. It's not as simple. Like, hindsight's easy, right? You've seen that from some of the politicians. I would have done this. I would have done that. I would have fired Fauci. And then you see the picture of them at a grocery store in a mask talking about how great the vaccine is. Like, I'm like, yeah, really? You would have done it? Like, it's easy to say that when you're not the guy. But like, you see their actual actions. You see the things they were doing at the time they would have been doing these things. And you're like, it's bullshit. You weren't going to do anything. That's nonsense. So I get it. And I think what we have to do now is we have to hold those people accountable. I'm sure, you'll agree if you look at my feeds and the things I've been saying over the last 2 years about what's going on with those people. I've been very vocal on the issue. But at the time, you didn't actually know. One of the great regrets I had during all of that process, even after having been through what I'd been through, 50 hours of testimony for treason, a crime punishable by death, Adam Schiff, the head of the Intelligence Committee, saying this on TV every day. I was out there and I was like, well, but the FBI and the CIA, they said that about General Flynn. Like, there's got to be some truth to it, right? There, like, because I wanted to believe that the Republic was strong, that these people had the best interests of our country at heart, and like, man, like if you believe the notion of America, you want to believe that still exists, but it doesn't. That's gone, as evidenced by every action after that. So that was a regret. I didn't come out against him. But I was probably more. I'm not exactly a silent individual. I talk pretty aggressively and pretty loud about most things. But I was like, there's got to be something here. I mean, this is the FBI. They must be dealing in good faith, at least a little bit. And then you realize, like, oh my God, they're not. The same people that labeled concerned mothers going to PTA meetings domestic terrorists because they were just saying, hey, I don't want my children to be indoctrinated with your bullshit. Like, they were labeled domestic terrorists, but a trans shooter with a manifesto targeting children, jacked up on chemicals that we were saying it's fine to give to 3-year-olds, but that couldn't buy a pack of cigarettes for another 15 years, but minor details. Like, that's the science. A group of people that a couple of years ago were literally labeled by our FDA or our medical institutions as like mentally ill. Well, that became unpolitically correct, so we can't say that. Like, that person gunned down Christian children. I don't see any outrage. I don't see any telethons from corporate media giving them billions and billions of dollars supporting this group. It's just Christians. It's okay. You go murder them in cold blood. It's the trans people that they're the real victims in all of this. I'm like, people have lost their minds, but we're not in a fair fight. The messaging is so lopsided and so skewed, and it's why we have to attack this so aggressively.
Donald, last question, not Donald, Don, last question. I have to ask you this, the nature of this show, Fearless, we're a very biblically based show. We talk about a biblical worldview all the time. I'm wondering if yourself, your dad, your family realize that we're in a spiritual conflict. And that's the one thing I do pray about for your dad, that he would come to a better understanding and relationship with God, because I think it would help him understand the conflict that he's in. And yeah. he would understand that they're really not after him, they're after God. And so does your dad have any thoughts along those lines? Does he have any understanding that we're in a spiritual war here?
And it's an interesting one. I sort of, I sort of did a joke meme about it. Like, hey, who else was persecuted right before Easter? I guess you're sort of walking a fine line with that one, right? Because I wasn't making the comparison, but I was, but it's also hard to sort of not look at the symbolism, of what's going on. And you're 100%, we are in a battle for the soul of our country. The attack on religion, on anything that would tie us to a higher being other than big government is so obvious. It's so palpable. I mean, I guess that's sort of de facto what I was talking about 45 seconds ago before that question, which is a group of Christian children can be mowed down in cold blood, and like they're not the victims. Like, if that was a Muslim school mowed down by a guy in the MAGA hat, these guys they were hoping for that to be the case. Everyone in the media, everyone in tech, please let it be an angry white, sociopath so that we can blame all white people, that we can blame all conservatives for the actions of one man. They were praying for that. They do it at every shooting. You see the tweets. You see the reaction. They're jumping to conclusions. It must be a white guy with an AR-15. Please, God, let him be wearing a MAGA hat. It's evil. It is evil, Jason. That is what we are up against. We are up against evil, and we have to overcome it. If we don't, I got 5 young kids. I wouldn't want to leave them the country in the direction that we're going right now, because we don't have long, in my opinion, before you go past that brink. I feel like we're edging closer and closer every day. And again, it takes things like what we saw yesterday for, I think, ordinary people who may be upset, who may feel a little bit of a pinch in their wallet because of stupid policy, to realize, like, oh my God, it's so much worse than we ever could have imagined. And again, I don't consider myself naive anymore. I've seen it. I've been a fly on the wall. I've been in the room. I've seen then what was reported about that. There's not a pretense of truth or objectivity even anymore. It's just narrative. And that narrative is entirely against us. And we have to fight for it. And that's, again, for me, it was a lot easier to be a real estate developer from New York. I promise you, I could go to the cool person parties. I could go anywhere I wanted. I could get a reservation. That's different now, but it's worth it, because what we're fighting for is worth it. That freedom is worth it. And we have no choice but to engage. But we all have to do it. We must be unafraid. If we sit back and hope that one person can do it, and that one person takes all the slings and arrows, they can take them out. They've proven that. They did that to the most powerful man in the world. We can't allow that to happen.
Like what you saw? Hit that like button, subscribe, and check out the full episode by clicking the link below.